You'll forgive me the Latin title, but it well encapsulates and describes the material to be covered in this video, and if literally translated, means "thus passes the glory of the world," a phrase used for centuries upon the occasion of papal coronations to remind the office-taker-to-be of the temporal and transitory nature of earthly titles and possessions, and the ephemeral shall be a major subject of this video. But before we delve into that in depth, I want to first talk about evolution, spandrels, and our relative uniqueness as human beings. I have spoken at length on the term spandrels in previous videos, but as a quick recap, the term, coined by the late paleontologist Stephen Jay Gould, describes those qualities or aspects of evolution that arise as byproducts of secondary characteristics without being directly relevant to adaptive selection processes. And human beings are fairly unique in that we possess that strange spandrel we sometimes refer to as the faculty of consciousness, and with that awareness and the ability to think. I say fairly unique because other animals do possess this ability to a lesser degree, but in this case, degree matters a great deal. With thought and awareness comes the inevitable observation that human desires, such as the desire to persist forever, the desire for a non-existent immutability, as well as the desire to have something beyond the directly accessible world, a fantasy, create a large measure of internal and external conflict, both on the individual level as well as the collective level. And this is the first glimpse into what might be called an evolutionary conflict between the spandrel and that which birthed the spandrel. If the human brain, and consequently its derivative, consciousness, gives rise to the multitude of things that we call culture, civilization, and most importantly, allows us to perceive reality in a way that goes beyond the base evolutionary processes that bind all other organisms, then a conflict between human thought and the world as it is inevitable, if said world does not correspond to the desires born of human thought and consciousness not shared by other organisms. But what exactly do I mean by that? Simply put, I mean the bevy of conflicting thoughts that arise in the human mind, as well as the juxtaposition of universal desires born of evolution and shared with all other organisms, such as the desire to self-replicate and the desire to survive long enough to do so. As much as we are all bound by some form of automatized behavior, pre-programmed into us by millions of years of evolution, we can, in fact, stand back for a while and understand that pre-programming. And more importantly, we can contemplate things that coexist along with that pre-programming without those things necessarily being a direct byproduct thereof. Some of these conflicting thoughts I've already talked about, or as if are already known to you. Mortality salience, for example, the certainty of death, and man's attempt to counter that by means of all manner of mental gymnastics, best exemplified by the many religious systems on hand. The smallness of one person in a vast world where that person is a subject of change but not the author of said change. The utter strangeness of being aware of these things to begin with. And one must admit, is it not strange that just yesterday you were 10 years old and now you're 40 with 3 necessary surgeries behind you, a broken marriage, and an estranged daughter? That is strange, or rather, it feels strange, because it runs counter to what we feel, in italics now, ought to be, but it turns out that the strangeness is only present if we choose, whether consciously or not, to be ignorant of certain demonstrable truths concerning reality and the human experience. Contrary to what many people think or feel, death is not a problem. Living is. Dying is relatively easy, and it is a certainty. In the past, when lifespan was significantly shorter and illness as well as poor environmental conditions took far more lives than today, people were almost naturally inclined to focus on what seemed to them a very plausible hereafter, because how could so short and brutish a life be all that there is? And they, disempowered by their ignorance through no fault of their own, having been born into their times, lacked the means to answer that question. Thus we have seen a focus on religious tradition throughout the ages on the hereafter, as a better alternative to the now. The perception and knowledge of our inevitable end is not shared by other animals, to our knowledge, to our best of knowledge, and has shaped much of civilization. And even to the extent that religious tradition, which admittedly is varied, provides some context for living, it is a life that is inexorably tied to the presumptive next one, which is problematic. In this video, I have no interest in discussing the possibility of a hereafter, should be no surprise to you, but I am concerned with the now. Do human beings live optimally given what we know of ourselves and reality? That is, the reality we dwell in. That is the question that I seek an answer to, though potentially I might be stuck in the seeking. And returning to the title of the video, Thus Passes the Glory of the World, from the Latin Sic transit gloria mundi, the problem we face as human beings is not death and not dying, but in living, which is the tricky part, and the part most difficult to navigate. Dying is easy, living is hard, and it is possible to reduce the reasons for this difficulty to just a handful. The foundation of most, if not all, human suffering lies in the desire for permanence. This idea is, of course, central to the schools of Buddhism, both the less popular and older Theravada tradition and the more popular Mahayana tradition. Now, I'm not going to spend much time discussing the details of different Buddhist schools or teachings that are not relevant to this core principle. I want to focus on this core principle. I am also, unsurprisingly, not a Buddhist, but one ought not throw the baby out with the bathwater, and in not doing so, we can jettison the metaphysical refuse and nonsense that is often attached to Buddhism, and focus on aspects that actually map onto reality in a demonstrable way. The most important and relevant thing that can be gleaned from Buddhist tradition is contained in what is referred to as the Four Noble Truths, allegedly taught by the Buddha himself, to which an understanding of the concept of dukkha is key. Dukkha stems from the Pali language, a language derived of Sanskrit, and is often translated as suffering, dissatisfaction, anxiety, stress, or unease, and there are a ton of other translations, all in that ballpark. With that said, the Four Noble Truths, and whether they're noble or not is irrelevant, can be summarized in the following order. The first truth is the truth of dukkha itself, which is simply that things are ephemeral, temporary, and impermanent, and always changing. The second truth is often referred to as the beginning of dukkha, which is an understanding of the fact that we crave the temporary, in spite of knowing the truth of the first truth, that is, the truth of dukkha, that things are temporary. We begin to crave these things. The third truth is the realization that if we in fact no longer crave the temporary and the ephemeral, we can actually bring an end to the process of dukkha, or the suffering. And lastly, the final truth is the solution, the means by which we can overcome dukkha. And there are a number of aspects or qualities to this. A lot of this involves mindfulness and meditation, the adherence to certain principles, such as resisting impulsive behavior. Once again, I need to stress that I'm not making any reference to the metaphysics that are attached to this, and there are a whole bunch, such as reincarnation and cycles of life. That doesn't interest me. It's a bunch of mumbo-jumbo. I'm focusing on the core principles without the metaphysical dressing. And it does not require great observational powers to realize that the world in which we live is in constant flux. And we human beings are part of and subject to that flux. We all grow old, fall ill, and eventually die. And yet we all seem saddled with a desire for permanence, a wish that things not change, and that they remain the same as if frozen in time. And consequently, we dress our world and surroundings with as many illusions as possible so as to fabricate this state. In addition to the redemptive and death-defying nature of religions and their deities, there is, of course, the aspect of eternity that is attached to said deities. So another aspect of religion, somehow related to this. And in the modern secular world, where religion has become scarce, we have other means of dressing and avoidance. The endless panoply of distractions, petty obligations we have to the world, allegedly, amusements, and in some sense, even the very structures we walk around, skyscrapers, the massive concrete, all these serve as a potent distraction from the reality of impermanence and give off an illusion of unchangeability. And they create a source of continual craving for the fictitious permanence that human beings long for by propagating this illusion endlessly. And we are all, almost to a T, participants in dukkha, because dukkha, or the suffering or dissatisfaction that comes from craving things that constantly change, is the hallmark of human existence and a human universal. Recognizing this and seeking an end to it, or a means of cessation, was the primary goal of the Buddha figure, if the legend is to be believed. Money, ambition, drive, and all these things traditionally associated with success, as well as the satisfaction allegedly derived from such success, being that these states are in constant change, can never deliver the satisfaction that they are said to supply us with. And the cycle is well known. Just an example, one begins project A, succeeds at it, the interest and satisfaction begins to wane, rendering project A no longer satisfying, which then leads to the craving for the next project, B, C, D, and can go ad infinitum, whereby the cycle begins anew and repeats itself, potentially endlessly, until the cessation of life itself, that is, death. And therefore, attaching primary importance to any of the things that fall into this cycle of craving and dissatisfaction will certainly lead to continual disappointment and unhappiness. This is where the evolutionary conflict comes into play. Dukkha and the Four Noble Truths are things that can be observed, and yet they run into conflict with our evolutionary urges, and this is simply because evolution, as a process, does not care anything about other qualities of human life apart from making copies of genes. It's all about gene replication and surviving long enough to do so. It has no concern for time, states of mind, humanity's place in the universe, or anything else that seems to concern human beings. But at the same time, man is saddled by evolution with these perpetual urges that will inevitably lead to his unhappiness and dissatisfaction, because they are incongruous with our nature as conscious creatures that are in fact aware of our mortality, as well as our ability to perceive the impermanence that surrounds us and is in fact part of us. The spandrel of advanced sentience and the consciousness damns us in ways that do not affect other animals, and man struggles with this. In former times, when death and illness were much more frequent, it led men to spend inordinate amounts of time contemplating the non-existent and creating whole worlds of fantasy, all the while peddling it as reality. And under the safe cover of modernity, it is the illusion that the modern and civilized somehow removes us from this fundamental conflict between observed truth, i.e. dukkha, or the nature of human suffering, and the urges we have been given that lend to us our tendency to ignore dukkha in the first place, and perpetuate the farce that this suffering can be countered by endlessly repeating the task that had led to the suffering to begin with. The problem lies in the solution. All the intellectual understanding in the world, as well as knowledge of evolution, cannot solve the problem of dukkha, because whilst one can intellectually grasp the concept, the cure to the illness does not lie in the intellect alone and requires a multifaceted approach as a solution. However, combining knowledge, such as the sort gained by going your own way, with a kind of understanding that comes with at least acknowledging that dukkha is a primary problem human beings face, can do much. Let us take an example, a classic scenario, and first apply a purely MGTOW analysis to it, and afterwards an analysis befitting a more universal understanding of human suffering without an evolutionary approach. The hypothetical but realistically plausible situation entails the following. A couple are married for 10 years and have 2 children, and the man finds out that the wife has been having an affair with a wealthy neighbor, and after this discovery she tells him that she's dissatisfied with the marriage and wants a divorce, and eventually a court settlement is reached, alimony is required, with visitation rights being imposed on the man with regards to the children, and so on and so forth, the usual. Now, we could do a traditional analysis talking about the differing selection pressures on the human male and female, hypergamy, all the processes and pressures that led to the man and woman making the choices they did in the marriage, as well as the reasons as to why the marriage failed within that context. And we could also scrutinize the biased family court system, and none of this in principle would be incorrect. In fact, most of it would be correct if the analysis is accurate. But it would only be partly correct with respects to the bigger picture, because even if we can account for every phenomenon in this failed marriage in evolutionary and cultural terms, or legal terms for that matter, we would still be missing the major fallacy committed by both participants, male and female, namely that both the man and the woman were seeking lasting happiness in a world where no such thing exists, specifically in the institution of marriage. Though in this context, marriage could be substituted here for just about anything else, such as career, playing a game, whatever. The lie of love is not that love does not exist per se, but its purpose and reason for existence is misconstrued and misunderstood. Recall that evolution only cares for making copies of genes, and within this context, love exists to fuel this process. Love, inasmuch as it is a real thing, and by real I mean an altered state of body and brain and chemical terms, exists solely to aid in genetic replication. Contentment and happiness have absolutely nothing to do with love, and it is, despite this, packaged and sold as such in our efforts to deceive ourselves. Evolutionary knowledge gives us a context and reason for love, but philosophy and contemplation, specifically on the nature of human discontent and suffering, allow us to understand the fallacy of misattribution committed by human beings with regards to love. Love is part of the vehicle of reproduction, not a means of happiness. And more to the point, love, as all things, is ephemeral. However, as we are inclined to do, we seek permanence in the impermanent. Both the man and the woman in this hypothetical situation made a crucial mistake, though motivated by different selection pressures, of believing that marriage and its accoutrements would provide lasting satisfaction. And this also explains why the woman then seeks contentment by proxy in the other man, yet another transitory source that will fail at some point in time, and thus the cycle repeats itself endlessly. And this, of course, could be repeated ad nauseum with any other number of examples. A goal is relentlessly pursued only to have the purpose behind the goal fall by the wayside. A new goal is begun to provide satisfaction. It founders after a certain amount of time, and so on and so forth. This applies to relationships, ambitions, games, marriage, and everything else in life. But rather than acknowledge this, we prefer denial. And central to this discussion is the need to talk about the empty self, or the lack of self, or of a concrete I. Now, it is true that I've made many videos where I use terms such as identity, and more specifically, I make reference to the self. But I use this term as a matter of convenience rather than conviction, because the self as a term is accessible, it's illustrative of certain points I'm making, and it often helps get the message across. And above all, it is very difficult not to avail yourself of widespread terminology or words that are ingrained in the language. But make no mistake, to understand the problem of suffering and craving and to find solution necessitates the understanding that the I, or the ego that one identifies with, that you identify with, is not but an illusion. Part of this can be facilitated by the practice of meditation. I'm sure many of you are familiar with meditation or have engaged in it, but I don't want to go too much into that at length here, other than it being a useful tool in understanding what is meant by the claim that there is no I. And it is the mistake of presuming that we are a coherent and unchanging I that leads us down the path of attachment, craving, and desire for permanence in the first place, because we falsely attribute a state of permanence to our identity in the form of ego, and then project that misapprehension of identity and ego onto the world, and this leaves us in a vicious circle of suffering and craving. It's quite simple. To better illustrate this, let's have a return to our hypothetical failed marriage. And once again, we could cite the evolutionary causes and the cultural problems associated with marriage without getting at the most fundamental of problems, namely two people falsely believing in a continuity of self and then projecting that false continuity of self onto the marriage project in this case. As long as people believe in a fixed and unchanging self or identity, projects, whether they be individual ambitions or marriages, will be embarked upon with the false narrative that they can somehow instill lasting happiness in one's life in a world where nothing is lasting, and nota bene, the self is perhaps the least lasting of anything. And there seems to be a naive and lackluster acknowledgement of this in the trite statement you often hear, people change. But the statement should be better put as everything changes, and internalizing the impermanence of the world, and consequently the illusion of the self, is not something that can be done in a single utterance, and it must be approached intensely using both contemplative and intellectual means. And it should be duly noted that at no stage does one truly achieve what is often called emptiness in the Zen Buddha tradition on a constant basis, that is, a constant state of emptiness and lack of I-ness. Rather, the realization and internalization of the empty self is better characterized by brief flashes of insight and temporary states of mind. And you needn't be a Zen master to realize this. I mean, think back to 10 years ago. The bacterial cells within you were different. The very molecules of which you were made were different. Your neurology was different, and consequently, the things you enjoyed were different. You were, in the most literal sense of the phrase, a different person. And yet, your first instinct as a false I is to ascribe a continuity of the current you to the past you as if you were one and the same, when this does not bear out the test of scrutiny. It's patently false if you give it any amount of thought whatsoever. And that is really all that is necessary to understand the puzzle of human contentment, or the human happiness project, as I like to call it sometimes. It begins with the false assumption of an unchanging and fixed I, which then projects the false assumption into the world, perpetuating a continual cycle of both misunderstanding and misery that only ends in death eventually. And going your own way can well be a first step in understanding this. You see, long before I ever had heard of the term or even embarked on the path of going my own way, I had studied certain Buddhist texts and ideas, specifically the Four Noble Truths, and had a sense of wariness towards the conventions that I was thrust into, as well as the claims that those conventions made pretense to: romantic partnerships, financial success, the fulfillment of ambition. Many, many winters before I'd gone my own way, I had already begun to cast doubt on the sustainability of things that people in their own conventions so often prized. I saw that the constant failure of relationships could only be linked to the changeability of nature itself, and indeed the changeability of human nature. And I had read more and more, and subsequently observed both in myself and in others, this changeability, this lack of permanence, this mutability. I saw the vicissitudes of wealth, a pauper one day, a man of means the next, the blessings of health, the condemnation of illness, and increasingly it became impossible to ignore the conventional human project people were engaging in was at the core inherently flawed, because the premise behind it had nothing to do with the reality we live in. And many winters later, in going my own way, I added to this knowledge of the whys and wherefores in the form of evolutionary science and a firm understanding of our biological background and history, and how the urges we feel came about. Much of my belief that less is more stems from an understanding how basic discontent arises in the human psyche, which does not mean that I'm somehow immune to it. I do have my regressions fairly often, and I fall back to moments of ego. But in the background, knowing the conventional desires and goals are all fraught with the same fundamental problems of presumptions of constancy and permanence of the self. The combination of scientific knowledge with the philosophical means of viewing the world in accurate terms could very well be the best way for human beings to proceed, unlikely as it is to happen. Humanity as a whole would benefit if it left the illusions it is saddled with behind, this probably being the greatest of all, for such illusions are the vehicle of unnecessary suffering.